Hello, hello. Tears of the Kingdom released about a month ago. It's a very good game, but certainly not a perfect one. This is what this video is going to be about. Normally, I don't touch new major releases due to fan honeymooning. Many people place more value on shared excitement rather than discussion. When they watch a video on the game they like, they're looking for vicarious enthusiasm. I'm a quiet, analytical, and somewhat unemotive kind of guy, so you probably understand. But I thought, this time, why not? As you'll see, Breath of the Wild is so similar to its sequel that most of the things I have to criticize about Tears of the Kingdom are actually problems from the first game. Before I start, I'm an artist who unfortunately met confluence with also being analytical and a writer, so this video will be part of a series called PlagueOfGripes. These are videos that are more podcast than video. You'll see background footage, but it may not necessarily be directly related to what I'm talking about. Gray Mine, my editor, is working on a couple of real videos in the meantime. This video will avoid spoilers. Alright, let's get started. Firstly, again, this is a fantastic game. Please remember this as I list all of its shortcomings. Just because something isn't perfect doesn't mean that it isn't exceptional. The same goes for you. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be willing to keep changing through self-evaluation. And most of these problems I have with Tears of the Kingdom will be things that did not change from Breath of the Wild, or actually got worse. It is a sequel after all, but that doesn't mean that some of these items don't warrant criticism. Some of these so-called issues are also subjective. In this video you'll have to not only determine which of these points is true, but also which is a big deal to everyone, and which is only a big deal to me, the writer. The opening is one of these things. Opening our story by walking down a corridor isn't exactly enthralling, nor is standing still while Zelda exposition dumps about what the game will be about. This is a case of telling rather than showing. No amount of loud, dramatic music being played over this elucidation is going to transform it into something gripping. We haven't even begun the narrative, so there's no way a revelation is going to mean anything. The scene immediately following it, however, is fucking radical. Matt Mercer does an amazing job in this role, and the villain, though the role is limited, is one of the best parts of the game. Matthew is unfortunately one of the only highlights of the English dub. The English voice acting in Breath of the Wild was mediocre, and that hasn't changed much. That game, however, was a bit more succinct in allowing you to start playing as soon as possible. It was also more enticing by sheer virtue of not knowing what the world was like. Early materials hinted that the world was in ruins and it was uncertain how much life we'd even find in it. This mystery is gone by now, of course, which is why I think they were trying to capture that again. It didn't work. Zelda elaborating on the Zonai especially makes no sense when you immediately encounter one minutes later. Too much time is wasted on telling the player information rather than allowing them to realize or find it. This is messy writing. There's also sharp discontinuities with what Link remembers or what others remember of Link. His memory loss from the first game was used to explain his need for constant explanation. Here he's, stupid? Or patronizing, maybe? I'll cover more of the writing later. Breath of the Wild's main issue with this tutorial was locking you to the plateau for such a long time. This did get better with this game's tutorial. However, Tears also gives you free roam prior to giving you a glider, which you absolutely require in order to complete shrines. It also doesn't technically tutorialize you on accessing towers, meaning you can't map anything. Both of these things were handled better in the original game. You shouldn't enable players to leave easily until they're fully equipped. I feel like the tutorial phase of a game like this could be much better. If, for example, you were playing the game a second time, it should be apparent how you could completely circumvent normal progression to get started within seconds of leaving the main menu. This should be possible, but very difficult for a new player to do without having foreknowledge on how to do it. The tutorials should be getting tighter, not more long-winded. That's my job. When you finally hit the ground running, tracking quests is still awkward in many cases. I'm not suggesting a goal should be find Zelda and the game just has a dot showing where she is. But in the case of mini-quests, there's only a very vague notion of where something might be. I assume this is born from the development goal of encouraging players to explore, but sometimes the descriptions can be ethereal. Some quests are Skyrim and some quests are Morrowind. As with the prior game, there are well over 100 shrines and even more Koroks. Also, many of the shrines are hidden. Needless to say, there are way too many shrines. It's a mechanic to populate the map with things to do, so I understand why they're doing it. I'd say the puzzles and goals in the shrines are better than Breath of the Wild. There were too many combat shrines in the original, and the puzzles were often ludicrously simple due to the potential for players discovering any one of them as their first shrine. That's one of the problems with open world games. Since there's no linear progression, you can't increment levels of skill at a task. It's all or nothing. There are ways around this, however. You can just not have so many shrines, for one, and just make them larger scale dungeons. You can also tether them together so that while you find a shrine, what's inside is not specific to the location, but specific to the skill required. This way you can find them at any point and it will always iterate on the skill being taught. Point being, Tears of the Kingdom made no attempt to fix this problem at all. The sonar or detection device used to locate shrines is also still pathetic. It thankfully detects up and down, but as with the original, the range has to be quite short. There are so many shrines that if the detection range was too wide, you'd be getting pulled in different directions. As a result, some shrines that are buried underground, of which there are way too many, are almost undetectable without standing in very specific spots. Shrines like this require a cave or a quest to activate, but there's no hint as to where those begin. If it's a quest, too bad, look it up online. If it's a cave, it could be almost anywhere across a gigantic mountainside. You'll end up needing to save on top of the mountain and sail off, looking around wildly for any hole or piled up boulders that may be concealing a hole. Then reload and jump off the other side. This takes forever and isn't rewarding or exciting, it's just an obnoxious waste of time. Topping this off, you can actually end up missing one or two shrines and have almost no way of knowing where they might be. This was a solved problem in most open world games over 10 years ago. You divide the world into sections and list how many of a collectible still exists there. If you have 9 out of 10, you know the thing you want must be somewhere in that region. Neither of these Zelda games does this at all. In Breath of the Wild, you either have to look it up online, or lawnmower your way across the entire game world, hoping your shrine detection would go off. In Tears of the Kingdom, you can technically go underground and try to map all the light routes there. Since the map stays dark in a region where you haven't found a light route, you can somewhat track down the approximate locations of them. Assuming you make a hover bike with a light bulb on the front anyway. And since a shrine is directly above a light route, you can awkwardly switch back and forth between the maps to figure out where one has to be. If you've ever played one of those Guess What's Different in the Picture games as a kid, it's like that, except instead of a cow juggling bowling pins in front of a barn that's red in only one of the pictures, it's a planet. Needless to say, this is a strain on the mind and the eyes. Also, if you're me, you end up missing one shrine that ends up being one situated directly over a town icon. A shrine you discovered but didn't finish shows up with yellow in the middle of its icon, and since there are so many icons on the game map with no way to turn any of them off, it ends up looking just like a normal shrine. This is to speak nothing of trying to track Koroks or anything else of that ilk. This is a terrible system. It is exhausting and has severe accessibility issues. The problems it faces have been solved for over a decade in other games. There is no reason for these kinds of problems to exist in a modern game other than willful obstinance. Much of it seems born of the desire to give players things to waste their time on, with no regard as to whether that wasted time was enjoyable. Speaking of wasting players' time with things to do mentality, the armor system has not changed since Breath of the Wild. Firstly, this is a subjective thing, but why are so many of the sets so ugly looking? Zelda has always been one of those settings that likes having hideous NPCs and stupid-looking cosmetics as part of its humor, but I really feel like they could do a little better, especially when there's so few new sets in the game. Although, honestly, a lot of this is being fueled by the fact that unique effects are still tied to armor. So if you want that attack up bonus instead of nothing, you will wear either the Deity or Barbarian set, or Radiant if you're using Bones. This has always been an argument I never quite understood in all sorts of games, but some people want there to be a reward for wearing everything from the same set. I don't know why. You can just wear the set if you like it. I'll give you the bonus without needing to. But some people want to be shot in the foot. I don't know why. That's just how they are. As for me, a thinking, reasoning primate, I would much rather the armor come with a bonus that you can then apply to whatever you want. This way, if I'm cold, I don't have to put on the stupid bird suit. I can continue wearing my favorite cosmetics without hating the way I look, because it's a video game full of wonder and magic, and I'm allowed to enjoy myself. Not that the dye system is helping this any. It hasn't changed at all since Breath of the Wild, which somehow makes it feel worse. As was the case before, dying takes forever to set up with the NPC, many armor sets can't be dyed at all for no reason, and when you do dye them, it totally drenches any dyeable surface with the same color, rather than shifting their hues, meaning you'll almost always be uglier than the default look. To top it off, the color selection is almost non-existent. The dye system is worthless and bad, and Sage, or Sagi, however you pronounce his name, should feel badly about what a pathetic job he does at it. To top it off, you'd still have to provide your own dye resources just to get it to work. What a lazy, incompetent bastard. But anyway, as far as armor buffs go, cooking can alleviate some of this, if you feel like wasting minutes of your time and precious resources creating it. You can give yourself a temporary buff, and then try to race through the content as fast as possible, because you're concerned about it running out. This also is neatly set next to the problem of all gameplay being Skyrim to death, by allowing players to open their inventory and eat an infinite amount of cheese wheels in frozen time to circumvent every health and damage concern. I have a great hatred of consumable items in games, especially systems that make you invincible so long as you keep spending money or time. I hesitate to offer a solution here because, since as you might guess, I don't like the cooking system. I don't like cooking in survival games because I have better things to do. Due to time dilation in games, I often find I have to eat every few minutes instead of enjoying the experience. I don't like cooking in this game because it uses up resources, wastes time, and either invalidates encounters or necessitates its use to fix the encounter into a winnable state. An old game design rule is to keep players out of their inventories as much as possible, and to minimize the UI. The logic is that the focus should be on the game, not the systems that support the game. Pausing Ocarina of Time to equip the iron boots wasn't acceptable in 1998, and pausing the game to bake or eat a dozen food buffs isn't acceptable here. I have no tolerance for the cooking system. I'd much rather the tools I require be actual tools. But I can still see why some people enjoy the fiction that throwing an unopened glass canister of milk and a strand of wheat chaff into a dancing bowl is somehow baking a pie. Congratulations, Gordon. But I would suggest making eating require some in-game animation that can be interrupted. Oh, he means Estus. Yes, I mean Estus. It's a good system. But this would also mean no inventories full of 100 baked apples or toasted Chex Mix that heals half a heart each. I'll make no secret that I dislike this part of the game, but there's nothing wrong with it necessarily beyond the complications of being able to pause the game at any time and devour the contents of an entire lake. Which is probably why enemies in this game do so much more damage than they used to, as some attempt to force even more resource use and provide extreme punishment for errors, since there are so many resources to ignore those punishments. Yet, still on the topic of armor, yes, we're still here, we have the upgrade system. It also has not improved. Alright, first strike. The fairy won't shut the fuck up. I've got a healthy case of misophonia, and these things moaning and kissing and licking and grunting with every button press do not sit well with me. This is especially unfortunate when coupled with Strike 2. It takes forever. You upgrade one piece of each set at a time, and it can take 4 or 5 times to finish one of the pieces of each 3-piece set. You can't upgrade some of them, but there are over 30 sets, not counting individual pieces that have no set. You can watch or skip an animation every single time you do this to any piece. Even skipping them, you can imagine how much time this takes up. Strike 3. It still requires an obscene amount of resources. You might find yourself opening a notepad document and listing out the hundreds of items you'll need so that you can go farm them and then take care of all your upgrades in one sitting. It's very expensive and very time-consuming. I've encountered this problem before, notably in Dark Souls. You can find a sword almost fully upgraded, and then find another sword that has the exact same animations and no difference in ability. It's just a visual change with better numbers. But you still have to start over from the beginning. You could just upgrade the class, since they're all effectively the same weapon, but they don't do that. And if you dare suggest just upgrading the class, lots of people rabble-rouse at you, but can't offer up an explanation at all on why it would be a bad idea. That's just the way it is, and they'll mindlessly defend it because you don't need to upgrade everything. And in Tears of the Kingdom, you could upgrade just one armor set while ignoring the rest. And that seems to be the general issue with a lot of decisions. The idea is that you don't need to do something. More importantly, this becomes a development opportunity in giving you something to waste your time on if you choose to do it. You don't need Korok seeds, you don't need every shrine, you don't need all the armor upgraded, and so the game attaches loads of time hurdles to these collectathon options because it can. With games even remotely similar to this, I've noticed a disparity in completion design. If you can 100% complete a game, it isn't expected of you, of course, but it's still fairly simple. A good recent example of this might be that Jedi Survivor game. You can find most of the stuff playing normally, but you might have to do a small second lap to finish things off. That's one end of the spectrum. On the other end, we have systems like Korok seeds. The idea is to populate the game with so many of them that you will find them. And the game world will feel less empty. But the moment you decide, I'm going to find all of them, the design falls apart because you're not supposed to look for them. You're supposed to enjoy their coincidental meeting. And there's hundreds to ensure that meeting will happen. A way of fixing this is the same way I suggested fixing shrines. Have hundreds of spawn locations but only a set number of encounters. But that would make the world feel more empty, which is important to note because it is empty. This type of content is an illusion, and open world games rely a lot on illusory content to make these vacant parking lots feel populated by something engaging. But anyway, the road to 100% completion can be 1 lap or 1 billion. Somewhere in between is something like upgrading your armor. It's possible to upgrade everything, but it's obviously not something they designed around. Otherwise, you could upgrade entire sets at once, or animations could only play once ever, or only once per conversation, or the resource could be exclusively rupees, or so on. There are lots of ways to mitigate this being an exhausting waste of the player's time. Yet the exact same issues remain from the prior title, and they remain because the philosophy is the same. You're not supposed to look for the metaphorical Korok. You're supposed to enjoy their coincidental meeting. And if you look for the Korok, it becomes an endgame feature for crazy people. If you're somehow still with me, congratulations. No, I get it, believe me, I do. But I hope you can see there are developing themes to these problems. One is that there's been very little attempt to change the formula from Breath of the Wild, which itself radically changed the formula in an attempt to revitalize the series. This is a little concerning because it paints a picture of a studio that is falling right back into the old habit that caused the problem in the first place. They're afraid of change, so they just don't want to change unless they have to. Even when something is obviously in need of improvement, they're too scared to try. Even though this is a sequel, there are plenty of things that were problems in the original that saw no effort applied to them at all. Another is that their design solution within this series has been to not try to design too much. They've embraced the idea that the game is inherently broken and a mess, and all problems will be solved by throwing resources at it. Puzzles, for example, are so esoteric in their approach sometimes that it's unclear what the intended solution even was. In some cases, I feel like there never was an intended solution, just a pile of debris and the assumption that the player has so much potential to break their environment that they'll be able to do something. And if they can't, they can leave and go farm resources and come back. Much of the game can be totally circumvented by using 2 fans and a control stick, after all. As long as you're willing to farm Zoanite, you can break the entire game. The game is designed to be completely broken, with the only requirement being wasted time. A third theme is that the developer uses "you don't need this" as a rationalization for creating time sinks. Korok seeds, bubble gems, armor upgrades, anything involving rupee farming, all the shrines, all the scales and claws and horns and so on. All of it are things you could do once for the experience and to upgrade or obtain one thing. If you want all of the thing, whatever the thing is, it now becomes in-game time sink. This transforms it into a way to extend the life of the game by wasting the player's time. After all, when you think about it, there really isn't that much content in the game. Most of your time will be spent gathering teleport locations by finding shrines, which enables you to more easily farm so you can extend your battery or find the armor you want and then upgrade it and figure out how to farm rupees and Zoanite. Then you'll be prepared for about 2 or 3 hours of actual prepared story content. The game is the diversions, after all. So when designing a diversion, all of them are styled as limited, coincidental discoveries. So let's keep an eye out for these 3 themes as we continue. Next, let me earn back your trust with something less controversial. Amiibos should be obliterated from history. There are things in both games you cannot acquire at all without either buying lots of little statues you may not like or have the room for, or just by emulating the game. Or they could just make everything accessible eventually but make the Amiibo an immediate option. Epona, a staple of the franchise for example, isn't in either game unless you buy one of these statues. They shouldn't do that. I don't think that's controversial, but I'm sure someone is outraged somewhere. Although, somewhat to their credit, Nintendo did make the Fierce Deity armor something you can obtain in-game, although it was probably just to append the game with one new armor set that they didn't want to have to make. Something perhaps a wee bit more controversial is the camera and sensor system. As with the prior game, you're encouraged to take pictures of things. You can then use the thing you shot as a means to track more of that thing. Take a picture of an apple, find apples. But as I said before, you're not meant to photograph everything. It's a tool you can use to track something, and there are a lot of somethings in Tears of the Kingdom. The moment you decide, I want to have a complete encyclopedia, you have a nightmarish grind in front of you. As with Breath of the Wild, you can spend rupees to randomly purchase entries, so now your camera grind becomes a rupee grind, and the opportunity to turn a system into a grind is complete. In the process of doing this, also be prepared for 80% of your pictures to be blurry shots of an elbow, or a box with a monster sort of behind it. To me, this is a basic mechanic. If you don't start the game with a full encyclopedia, you should at least be able to obtain huge categories of similar listings. Say by fighting a mob enough times you automatically unlock it. Taking a picture of it would just replace whatever the gallery image is. But these are the thoughts of someone who doesn't want to create needless time buffering irritants. Speaking of time buffering irritants, after every shrine you receive a blessing from Jesus or something. It plays a 5-hour-long movie of you receiving it. You can skip this, although you have to skip it twice because it's technically 2 distinct cutscenes. I have a great idea. Don't have a cutscene. Once you complete a shrine, just have the screen go white, and you appear back on the overworld with the blessing in your inventory. I don't feel the need to explain why this should not have been an issue in Breath of the Wild, and it certainly should not have been recreated with all new cutscenes to preserve the same problem here. People would sometimes complain about opening chests in the older Zelda games having unskippable cutscenes, but that only happened for about less than 10 seconds with large chests with boss keys, new weapons, or at worst a compass or a map. And that's nowhere close to the nonsense happening here. Time-wasting animations occur in all sorts of other places. If you add a heart or stamina wheel using those blessings, there's a cutscene. If you offer a Korok seed to Hestu, he has to recount the entirety of the 1959 film Ben-Hur by the medium of dance. Every time. Dyeing your armor, cutscene. Upgrading your armor, cutscenes. Entering a shrine, a cutscene describing what to do in the shrine. Every time. Even on reloads. Even if you've done that same shrine type before. The actual story is also arguably a waste of time. There's very little actual substance to Tears of the Kingdom. Due to the game being open world with no way of knowing which area will be done first, each of the 4 areas repeats the same plot beat. Where'd she go? Oh, this place is weird. The naughty juice is coming from up there. Hey, I'm an unnamed ghost with no personality that fought the bad man. Enjoy this cashew. And that's it. That's the majority of what you might very liberally call a story. Just because it's especially windy or gooey or everyone is eating Big Macs doesn't shrink wrap the same story in enough elements to make it an exploration of each region. It's the same concept with paint on top of it. And the story it's painting is a single obvious reveal that everyone figures out minutes into the game. It's presumably because the game isn't linear, but just because a story isn't in order doesn't mean the stories can't be self-contained. The best part of the story, like Breath of the Wild, are optional cutscenes, and just like Breath of the Wild, they're completely disjointed, which ends up ruining the experience. I have a little theory that the developers knew how little story they had, so they felt compelled to fluff up all the extraneous dialogue. So, NPCs can't shut the fuck up. Anytime you talk to someone on the road, what could have been a single line of dialogue like, "Yeah, I saw a weird lady over there. Hail Hydra," turns into a rambling, directionless diatribe about the state of the world and what that NPC had for breakfast. It's like watching my dead father harangue some confused Tractor Supply employee about InfoWars. Then the employee looks at me and I nod to let him know, yeah, this is your life now too. Perhaps the experts in wasting time, however, are backpack Koroks, who, in their folly, their hubris as would-be avaricious hobo gods, have a metric assload of garbage tied to their backs. You're a tree, my man. What you got back there? Plot contrivance? What's that? Opioids? Oh, right. And so these little bastards demand you carry them like a spoiled baby to their best friend. They're hitchhikers. Unlike a hitchhiker, they almost always want you to carry them in the opposite direction of where they know you're going, or back where you came from. If you're wondering why so many videos involve crucifying or baking these little vagrant vegetables, it's because they're designed to waste your time. Rarely it's an actual puzzle, but usually the solution to their puzzle is building a Ford F-150 using your resources and your zoonite. If you don't, you're punished by carrying them over a whole mountain using your bare hands. While it isn't fun to carry this sapient garbage over all of Hyrule, it is fun to launch them over it, into lava. It's amazing to me that the developers took one of the most irritating aspects of Breath of the Wild, seed hunting, and somehow made it even more tiresome and unengaging. The Hudson Sign guy is more fun than these future salads. Speaking of NPCs who can't learn, when you're building your home, a guy named Grantison follows you around. This may be some weird Japanese thing, but the fact that he's constantly looming over your shoulder and watching your every move makes you feel like you're being watched by a bigoted convenience store owner. Hey, sir, I'll let you know when I need you. Fuck off. And since this little turd has to hang off your every motion, he's constantly getting in the way. I can't count the number of times I was trying to snap two rooms together and I couldn't, because he'd inserted himself between them. Or he was now crawling under the foundation like a feral possum. Get out of here! It doesn't help that the building rotation controls are a little odd. The button you press most of the time is the right shoulder button, so you'll find yourself accidentally throwing your weapon when your brain wants to move something. Really, controls in general are still an issue from the prior game. You still can't rebind. You can switch your jump and run buttons for God knows what reason, but that's it. Every other game with this third-person control scheme has solved this problem since the 2010s. And in those games, if you don't like those controls, you can rebind them. You know, like a big boy game does. This might also be another Japanese cultural thing, and I only say that because I know there's this mentality that the person who makes something always knows better than you, and you're having the experience they planned for you. It's like a chef getting angry at you for putting ketchup on a steak, I think. But this isn't steak, it's your hands. It feels extremely childish and close-minded to lock out the ability to interface with a video game in 2023. Some of the control problems stem from having too many subsystems. With the addition of the fusing system and this integrating into awkwardly firing arrows, there's a lot going on. When you try to attach something specific to an arrow, you can end up spending well over a minute scrolling through thousands of items just because the inventory is so bloated. It doesn't help that there's sometimes input delay, which means entering your menu is usually faster and safer than switching weapons and bows and shields using the D-pad. Also, why is there still a whistle button? Horses were almost worthless in the first game, and they're entirely worthless in this one. Whistling can lure enemies, I guess, but are we really ruining an entire button for that? The entire control scheme could probably be tightened up. There are too many systems for too few buttons. This is the most obvious with the new champion power system. It's actually the same system as Breath of the Wild, but much worse. In fact, it might be the worst magic or power system in any mainline Zelda game. In the prior game, these were activated contextually. You crouch, use a charged attack, or just get hit. Not very active or exciting, but it worked well. In this one, there are NPCs that walk around you, and to use your power,
you have to find them, run towards them, and catch them long enough to mash their interact button, assuming you interacted with the right one. Spoiler, you didn't. So, not much context. It has personality, I guess. But, when you want to pick up some fruit on the ground, Tulin's personality likes to dive bomb you so that he can blow all that fruit off the side of a cliff or into the ocean. Riju's power works on ranged attacks, and so she insists on running into melee. Unless you're in melee, then she runs away from you. Yonobu's favorite thing, meanwhile, is to block your camera and weigh down the front of anything that you're flying so that you'll crash into a mountain. Oh, and you, Sidon? Your wife is hot and you didn't bring her, which is the biggest faux pas of all. So yeah, they're brimming with personality. So much so that there's an option in your inventory to stow them away because the developers were aware of how obstructive they are. I do like that you have the option of having your own little gang, but this is a poorly conceived system. In an older Zelda game, these would have just been items or a power, which is funny because there's room on the power wheel for them. Take a look at our powers that are on the power wheel. Ultra Hand, Auto Build, Fuse, the fucking amiibo, Recall, the map you already access with the select button, Ascend, and your camera. First things first, get rid of the map and the camera. You can access those in the main menu even if you don't alter how the camera works, which you should. You can even put it on R3 since when you press it, you go into first person mode anyway. Second, burn the amiibo. It doesn't belong anywhere. Next, Auto Build and Ultra Hand are the same ability. You can just tie Auto Build into Ultra Hand as an option when it activates. Fuse is also the same ability, but that one might get a little futzy. You can make it a menu option instead if you really needed to. That gives you a wheel with 4, maybe even 3 powers on it. Well, look at that! You now have plenty of room for all 4 of your stage abilities. One of them is still mostly contextual, Tulin's, so you may not even need that one. You could also make Riju's contextual since it's used with a bow. So honestly, you only need 2, and I can make those contextual too if I wanted to. It would be easy. All you have to do is not marry yourself to design bloat. I will give Tears of the Kingdom this though. They didn't try to keep the slate powers from the first game. God, I hated the bombs. And it feels like Cryo was only there for glitches and to make the game miserable to play. And Stasis was a durability assassin. It was time to move on from those, and they actually did it. Credit where credit is due. The replacement abilities aren't all that amazing, though. Ultra Hand, Auto Build, and Fuse are obviously the staple abilities and what they put all their time into, but like I said, they're all kind of the same power. I'll cover the Fuse system a little more later, but yeah, Fuse just physically glues 2 models together with snot. Sometimes by shrinking or expanding the thing you're fusing. It's pretty awful looking. But maybe they want it to look bad? This is Zelda, after all, where everyone but the main cast are usually potato-faced ghouls. It's part of the joke, so maybe that's what they were going for. Due to how weight and battery power works, you're pretty limited in what you can reasonably create with Ultra Hand. A lot of content is solved with just a hover bike, so you end up optimizing out most of your options. You don't need an airplane or a monster truck 90% of the time. The rest of your builds will be either garbage like trees glued together, fish bundles to siphon fish out of the water, or idiotic meme builds like a penis robot. Most of the time you'd like to make something, the stuff you'd need is nowhere nearby, especially control levers. And Hudson's garbage piles are only good for making wagons, and no one is pulling a wooden wagon around Hyrule unless they have to. So Ultra Hand revolves a lot around Zoanite ore farming and buying Zoanite orbs. And Auto Build is a glorified favorites menu, since the schematics the game gives you just flood your menu with junk you'd never actually build. Recall is a great power, and I'm incredibly glad it replaced Stasis. I hated Stasis. Recall does unfortunately totally break most puzzles, though. Instead of wasting 30 minutes building some absurd, ugly contraption to move an object, you can just run to the end, recall it into the sky, and grab it. Not that I'm complaining. Some of the things they want you to do would be miserable without it. Ascend was an ability I was a little excited to use, but figured they'd be so paranoid about its use, that it would be almost useless, and yeah, that's kind of what happened. The developers, you can tell, go through painstaking lengths to ensure floating platforms are too jagged, too far, or concave enough that you could never use Ascend. There are a lot of rooms that are perfectly spherical just to ensure that even if you create a janky platform to ascend through, the ceiling is too rounded to allow it. Once you start looking for it, it's hard not to notice how almost everything in the game is perfectly flat or rounded in a particular way. The difference between intentional ascent spots and everything else is stark. Ever so often you can find a stray triangle or polygon someone forgot about, even if it takes about 20 seconds of fidgeting to align yourself on it. Since so much of the game is underground, you'd think it'd come up more often, but your power doesn't take you to the surface unless it was planned for a specific spot. Point being here, the reward of a power like this is to let the player feel like they're cheating, even if they're not. But the game areas are so baby-proof that it ends up making you feel that much more fenced in at times. Most of your powers will end up running off of resources, especially Zoanite. This also applies to batteries, which at the start of the game are almost entirely worthless. They probably went overboard with how little energy you have to work with at the start. They also don't do a good job of tutorializing how to add more batteries, since they're so miserly about handing out charges at first. You'll eventually have to start mapping out farming routes underground if you want the supplies to do anything fun. Unfortunately, since so much of the game operates off of farming resources, this can make the experience start to feel more like a job than an adventure. You may one day realize that you spend more time planning on how to earn rupees, charges, farm zoanite, and find bubble frogs than you do anything else. The same issue carries over to fighting enemies in a lot of cases, just as it did in Breath of the Wild. Why would you engage in enemy encampment when it will just drain all your resources and give you no reward? It's less of a pain in the ass than in the original game this time, but if you're carrying around strong weapons, you'll probably not want to waste them just to get a couple of moblin horns, rusted swords, and some box apples. Again, it can vary wildly. This all comes back to the game being open world and focused on resource acquisition and resource loss. So much so that players are rabid about finding ways to cheat more resources in via exploits. Knowing you need 70 star fragments to complete all your armor upgrades is something you can mentally brush off if you just shoot them across a loading zone underground with a 5x bow, so you can manufacture them out of thin air. Why would you waste effort setting up 2-hour-long hunting routes to make gourmet meat skewers to sell for a few hundred rupees, when you can duplicate diamonds in a few minutes? You can even run out of arrows very easily if you start fighting Gleeoks one after the other. It also doesn't help that Link is still too stupid apparently to just make them out of wood, so you might end up needing to also farm merchants for small arrow bundles. Then you have to learn how to do Blood Moon reset glitches by firing opals into boulders and then reloading the game, just to get around restock and respawn limits. The game makes a big deal about fusing things together, but some resources are still rare enough that the game doesn't give you much room to learn about what they do. If you're walking around with a silver Lionel saber horn, you may be tempted to fuse it onto a weapon, but you might need it for some armor upgrade later that you don't know about. Or you just don't want to fuse it into a long stick or break apart one of your existing weapons to use it, so you end up just not using it. If I get 10 of them, I'll try one, you might think. Megalixir Brain. It doesn't help that there are hundreds of types of items, and the vast majority of them are useless as fuse options, despite the fact that the game will let you use them. Most are intended to be filler items for the cooking system, yet here they are, clogging up the throw and arrow fuse menus. A most use filter does not fix this problem. You won't know what all these rare items do either, so you need to save and reload to test them all out, or watch an annoying YouTube video about it. One that has a lot of flashing lights and sound effects. Maybe throw in a few Discord notifications so that you think your girlfriend needs something, but no, it's just the creator being a zoomer idiot. Fun stuff. People don't want to do these things. It's a waste of time. It's better to get that crap out of the way so you can get back to playing the game, right? But as we've covered, that is the majority of the game. Grinding for things you don't want so you can complete tasks that you don't need. This is the general takeaway to how the game is designed. It's a game that wants you to break it. After Breath of the Wild, I think they saw how players took their carefully thought out plans and atomize them. And rather than deciding that they should be more careful, they decided to focus entirely on encouraging players to blitz the game and try to ignore the basic mechanics. As long as you have a massive stack of Zoanite, nothing is going to pose a threat to you, even if you're not even holding the controller anymore. The thing is, though, that was the right decision. For this kind of game, that is. I mentioned before that I don't really care for open world games. They're fun to roam around in for a while, but they always have the same problems. They're vast, open parking lots until you pepper them with content, and that content can't be unique because there's too much space. So the open world content is usually rather boring and repetitive. There's just a lot of it. And because there's a lot of it, that means the player has to do some exterior collision testing on the map edges, and lawnmower their way across the entire game world, and arduously pencil in everything they see. This usually results in people creating and referencing online interactive maps. This way you don't have to deal with the headaches of this genre people supposedly love so much. It's either that or play the game organically, and ignore 80% of the supposed content. Just try to get to the end credits, and if you saw something, you saw it. The logic of that kind of open world experience is very casual, and operates on the founding logic that most of the content isn't important or unique anyway, so as long as you encounter one version of it at some point, that's acceptable. To me, since open world games require such an obscene amount of resources and effort to create, I don't see that as being a worthwhile design goal. I also don't care for overly linear games, if that's what you're thinking. No, my preference is actually for a series of interconnected zones that themselves are large enough to explore, but not so large as to lose their identity. It should come as no surprise to my longtime viewers that Dark Souls 1 is a great example of this. More so when you have the Master Key and can go almost anywhere. To me, that's the perfect way to make a free roam game. Creating massive landscapes doesn't really add anything to the experience other than marketing shots. Coincidentally, another good example of this is older Zelda games. The only problem is that they're usually gated at some point by the story, but most of them have densely packed unique areas that still warrant exploration. They also have a Hyrule feel that is its own little open world, and guess what? Most of the criticism of those Hyrule fields is that there's nothing in them, just like an open world. I guess they didn't have enough Koroks in them, right? Maybe Ocarina of Time needed 30 combat shrines encircling Lon Lon Ranch. Then it would have been good. I say weapon durability for last, just because it's always such a long-winded topic and I didn't want people in the comment section to get distracted by it. Since almost nothing has changed about durability since the first game, I will instead point towards a previous little gripe I made on the subject of weapon durability. It's fairly recent too, since I waited for the honeymoon to be over so no one would lose their minds about it. The gist of it is that if you're going to have a durability system, a lot can go wrong. I cover a lot of reasons why conventional solutions that people think of do not work. I also go over a lot of reasons why the current approach doesn't work either. The best solution I could think for Breath of the Wild was to use some of the things you loot to restore durability to your favorite weapons, like destroying weak swords to restore the one you have equipped. Which is funny because that's arguably what they did. They just did it by duct taping mushrooms to shields or spot welding two swords on top of each other. Did that fix the durability system? No, of course not. You can't fix a system like this. You can only make it acceptable for people that would have accepted it anyway. The core problems still exist. You can't value a favorite weapon because it's all future garbage. And there's not much point to forcing players to cycle weapons when there are only basic animations for one-handed, two-handed, spears, magic rods, and boomerangs. The logic of we need to make players stop using the same thing never made any sense because the actual pool of weapon types is non-existent. The difference between even the Master Sword and a tree branch is mostly cosmetic. One has the cut effect and can toss discs when at full health, and the other has scroll droppings on it. And that's it. They're the same weapon. The durability system isn't there for some enlightened path to wisdom and the training of you, the hero, in all forms of combat. It's there to cement the idea that this is a game about scavenging garbage. It may come as equally unsurprising to you that I much prefer the older style of Zelda games to these two. I like having a Master Sword, a Bigoron Sword, a Ball and Chain, a Hookshot, Ice and Fire arrows, and so on. And they never break. You just have them. and puzzles are usually solved, not broken with a single trick you reuse every time. I haven't mentioned them, but I'm glad some form of dungeons are back. Kind of. In Breath of the Wild, the intense sameness and short length of the Divine Beasts was uninspired. The 4 region shrines in this game are at least visually interesting. They're also very short and rely a lot on awkwardly fusing things together. And several times, especially the Goron one, they feel like they're broken in some way. Was it okay to ignore 80% of the dungeon and just glide and climb to the objectives? They're also all very open air, which makes them feel unfinished in a weird way. None of them capture that same feeling as an old temple, though. The bizarre otherworldliness of the Forest Temple or Spirit Temple in Ocarina. The quaint familiarity of Snow Peak Ruins in Twilight Princess. Even the inventiveness of the time-shifting Lanayru mines in Skyward Sword. No, none of the regions in Wild or Tears have that kind of atmosphere to them. They're fine, but not really memorable in the same way. Especially when you're mainly just gluing icicles to gears and fighting constructs. But to avoid sounding too much like an old fogey, those are my problems with the game. Now, think back to our 3 themes. 1. Many elements of Breath of the Wild remain unchanged. 2. The game design is inherently made to be broken as a goal. And 3. The majority of the experience is bloated by time sinks with the mentality that you don't need things, so will make you slog for them. Are these true? Yeah, I would say so. But I would say that it's also the nature of this kind of game. If you're making an open-world experience that is heavily centered on durability, resource use, and so on, you will run into these things. It will also be very hard to change them. Some people have referred to Breath of the Wild as a tech demo for this game, because Tears of the Kingdom is effectively the exact same experience. Not much changed. Even Ocarina and Majora were very different games, despite using the same assets. The Oracle games as well. Wild and Tears are different, but not by much. If a third game releases using this formula, I don't know what they'll do with it. There's only so many times you can alter the terrain, switch out powers, change the champion abilities, and call it a new experience. I'm not saying Tears isn't different enough, only that the depth to design potential for this kind of direction is probably less than you think. My biggest concern is that Nintendo EPD and Aonuma's teams have a tendency to not listen to feedback. More importantly, it feels like they don't like to change winning formulas either. That's what got them into trouble in the first place. They kept remaking the same thing over and over again. Breath of the Wild was a big deal because it was totally different, and Tears of the Kingdom is effectively the same game. Even more so than any prior title was compared to its predecessors. I'm also concerned that they'll slip into the same logic Bethesda did with the Elder Scrolls. They saw players liked breaking the game and decided to lean into it. Now they refuse to stop using a broken engine from the 2000s because they're scared that their skill as a developer won't replace their viral marketability as an incompetent designer. I'd hate to see Zelda become that funny meme game with the crazy physics. Tears is leaning into the break the game aspect of the design, and there's only so far you can take that thought before you're making Gary's mod. Considering the design drain these kinds of games have in production, I hope they decide to return to also developing more conventional Zelda experiences in the future. Making more of these open-world titles is fine, of course, they're good games. But I hope players can recognize what they're missing out on. It's been over 20 years since Wind Waker came out. They effectively jumped into a new genre, but you can also modernize the old one. It's just that Skyward Sword didn't set the world on fire because of motion controls and the sort of dopey presentation, so they probably panicked about that internally. It's okay for weapons not to break sometimes, and it's okay to have a hookshot, or a giant hammer. Some of the people listening to this probably weren't even born when Twilight Princess came out. So when old people complain that there's too many old Zelda games, they should also remember that there's an entire generation that's never even seen one that's contemporary to them. And they look at Majora's Mask the same way that we looked at Pitfall. Although that said, Pitfall was awesome. So that's the video. I'm not angry about these issues, I just saw them. Except the armor upgrade thing, I'm angry about that. If you want to hear my thoughts on weapon durability, check out my video on it. It's in the description. It still applies, and probably will still apply to the next game too. Because the next game will be this game, just as this game is the other game. See you next time, in the other video.